You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
When contractor Jonah Rise arrives at the abandoned Willard Asylum to inspect a derelict building set for demolition, he expects hazards like rotting wood and mold, not something sinister lurking in the shadows. But inside Building 8, a hidden basement reveals a terrifying secret. A long-forgotten therapy room filled with marionettes and a haunting past of twisted experiments. Soon, Jonah and his co-worker Mark find themselves trapped in a nightmare, forced to confront an evil presence pulling strings from beyond the grave. What began as a routine inspection becomes a desperate fight for survival, because once the strings attach, escaping might be impossible. If you love true horror that creeps under your skin and never lets go, subscribe now and hit the bell icon, because some stories aren't just told, they're performed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sprinted through the dark hallway of Building 8. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the peeling wallpaper. The beam of my flashlight jittered with each panicked step. Far ahead, I heard the crash of something heavy and a strangled scream that cut through the silence. That was Mark, and he sounded absolutely terrified. I skidded around a corner, nearly losing my footing on debris. The stench of mildew and decades of rot clogged my throat as I gasped for air. "Mark, where are you?" I yelled again, desperation cracking my voice. A distant flicker of light, Mark's flashlight, wavered through a doorway at the end of the corridor. I barreled toward it, fear pounding in my veins. As I burst into the room, the sight in my flashlight's glare made me stop cold. My co-worker Mark was hanging 3 feet off the ground in the center of the room, limbs splayed unnaturally. His eyes bulged in panic. There were ropes or wires coiled tight around his wrists and ankles, stretching upward into the gloom above. He jerked and twitched in midair, as though an invisible puppeteer had him on strings. For a split second, I just stood there, paralyzed by the impossible scene. Mark's contorted face turned toward me. He opened his mouth in a silent plea, but then he was yanked higher with a violent jolt, a gargled cry ripping from his throat. I finally found my legs and lunged forward to grab him, adrenaline overriding my terror. But as I reached out, something yanked me back, hard. I toppled onto the dusty floor. In the beam of my fallen flashlight, I saw a thin, frayed cord cinched around my left wrist, tightening on its own. I clawed at it frantically as Mark's screams crescendoed, echoing in that awful chamber. In that moment, as darkness closed in and an unseen force tugged at both of us like playthings, one panicked thought flashed through my mind. We're not alone in here. A few days earlier, I had no inkling of what was waiting for me in Building 8. Back then, it was just another work site, the last derelict structure slated for demolition at the old Willard Asylum in upstate New York. My name is Jonah Rise. I'm a contractor, and I've overseen plenty of building teardowns. On Monday morning, when I first arrived at the sprawling, abandoned campus of Willard, I was thinking about budgets and timelines, not ghosts. Building 8 loomed at the edge of the property, a 4-story brick husk separated from the newer buildings of the drug rehab center that Willard had partly become. The asylum itself closed in 1995, leaving dozens of buildings to decay. This one, number 8, had once been an administration and therapy wing, according to the old campus map I'd been given. It stood apart, barred up and forgotten. As I walked toward it, crunching over broken glass and dead leaves, I noted how the early autumn sun seemed to dim in its shadow. At the padlocked entrance, I met up with Mark and a grizzled maintenance supervisor named Dave who managed the grounds. Dave fumbled with a ring of keys, muttering, "Nobody's been in here for ages. Be careful in there. Floorboards are probably shot." He gave me a sidelong look. "Heard some odd stories about this place, you know." I paused, one hand on the rusted padlock. "What kind of stories?" Dave shrugged, not meeting my eye. "Back in the 60s, they say some patients went missing in this building, never found them. Lot of strange stuff happened in old asylums." He exhaled and forced a laugh. "Probably just ghost tales. Anyway, I'll be outside if you need anything." Mark and I exchanged glances as Dave hurriedly stepped back, clearly eager to be away. "Well, that's comforting," Mark joked, raising his eyebrows. He was trying to play it light, but I could see the uncertainty in his face. I snorted, shaking off the unease. "People love to make up spooky stories. Let's focus. We have a job to do." With a groan of metal, I cut the padlock and pushed open the heavy front door. The corridor beyond the door stretched ahead of us, illuminated in weak daylight slanting through grimy windows. The walls were a sickly pale green, scabbed with peeling paint and creeping black mold. Plaster dust and paint chips floated in the beam of our flashlights as we stepped inside. Debris littered the floor, chunks of plaster, curled linoleum tiles, and bits of broken furniture. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the building was holding its breath. Our footsteps echoed hollowly down the long hall, and I felt a prickle of nerves at the back of my neck that I couldn't quite shake. "Man, would you look at this place?" Mark murmured, sweeping his flashlight over the gaping doorways lining the hall. Each room we passed was dark and strewn with trash. Old bed frames here, a collapsed desk there. The paint was shredded from years of dampness and neglect. We moved slowly, calling out to make sure no squatters or animals were around. My job was to inspect the structure and flag any environmental hazards before the demolition crew came in. Mark, my junior site manager and all-around handyman, was snapping photos on his phone to document conditions. Despite the morning light, the farther we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. "Feels like a tomb," I muttered, mostly to myself. Mark nodded, stepping over a mouldering mattress that had collapsed through the floorboards. "I've been in some nasty abandoned buildings, but asylums are a different breed, huh?" He tried on a grin. "At least the ghosts get peace and quiet." His joke fell flat in the silence. I cleared my throat. "Check that the support beams aren't rotted through. Last thing we need is a collapse." We split up within sight of each other, poking around with our flashlights. I found an old nurse's station with rusted file cabinets. Inside one drawer was nothing but a mouse nest and a desiccated bird corpse, which I quickly shut away. Mark peered into what had been a patient day room. "Whoa, Jonah, check this out," he called. I walked over and saw him shining his light into a corner. An old wheelchair sat alone in the room, facing a barred window. The vinyl seat was torn, its once green colour faded and mottled with mildew. It looked as if someone had just left it there decades ago and walked away. The sight of that lone wheelchair in the empty, decaying room made my skin crawl. The walls around it were flaking paint and smeared with mould. The wheelchair's metal frame was reddish with rust, and one of its small wheels had collapsed, causing it to tilt at a forlorn angle. Sunlight filtered through the dirty window bars, illuminating motes of dust around the chair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just imagined the countless patients who had sat in that chair, staring out at freedom through those bars. Mark broke the spell with a low whistle. "Creepy. Think it'll start rolling on its own?" he quipped, giving me a crooked grin. I chuckled uneasily. "If it does, I'm out of here," I replied. We moved on, but I caught myself glancing back at the wheelchair more than once. It remained perfectly still. On the third floor, we found what must have been a recreation room. Shelves still lined one wall, mostly empty except for some mouldering books, and I squinted. There, propped on the middle shelf, was a small marionette puppet. It was dangling, half sitting against the wall as if someone had left it on display. The puppet was about 2 feet tall, a crudely made figure of a boy with faded paint for clothes. One glass eye was missing, and its wooden head lolled to the side. Several strings coiled at its feet, the control bar nowhere to be seen. The thing was coated in dust and cobwebs. Mark gingerly lifted it off the shelf. "Well, this is something you don't see every day," he said, coughing as dust puffed off the puppet. With a playful grin, he made a theatrical voice. "Gee, Doc, I feel just fine," as if the puppet itself was speaking to a doctor. His voice echoed emptily in the dead room. I gave a soft laugh, but I couldn't shake how the puppet's remaining eye seemed to stare at me. "All right, enough. Put Pinocchio down, we've got work," I said. I tried to keep my tone light. Mark set the marionette on a dusty table instead of returning it to the shelf. I noticed he kept glancing at it, though. "Why do you think a puppet's here? Maybe some kind of patient art therapy," he mused aloud. "Could be. They did occupational therapy back then. Woodworking, crafts. Maybe a patient made it." I offered. It was plausible, yet an uneasy feeling nagged at me. We continued our survey, leaving the puppet resting on the table. Eventually we finished up the upper floors. By late afternoon, daylight was fading and we were eager to wrap things up. All that remained was the basement. The basement access was via a stairwell at the end of the first-floor corridor. A heavy metal door marked Therapy Wing, lower level, was locked with a rusted chain. We came armed with bolt cutters and a crowbar, snapping the chain off in short order. The door creaked open, and a wave of cold, damp air whooshed out from below, carrying the smell of wet concrete and decay. "Lovely," Mark muttered, clicking on his high-powered flashlight. We descended carefully. The basement was much darker than the floors above, with only tiny barred windows near the ceiling letting in thin slivers of dusk light. Our flashlight beams revealed a narrow corridor lined with several doors. Most were simple wooden doors, some standing ajar to reveal small storage closets and boiler rooms with ancient corroded equipment. As we moved down the hall, our lights caught something painted on the wall at the far end, an arrow and the word Obedience in flaking black paint pointing to the right. "Obedience?" Mark read aloud. "What on earth?" My heart had begun to thud in my chest. We followed the arrow around a corner to a heavier door made of reinforced wood. A tarnished placard on it read, "Therapy Room 6. The rest of the label was scratched out. The door was closed. A thick padlock hung from a hasp, hanging open. The chain that had once kept this door shut was already cut and lay discarded on the floor. I exchanged a wary look with Mark. Had someone been here before us? The cut looked old. Perhaps another maintenance crew long ago? With a deep breath, I grasped the door handle and turned it. It wasn't locked. The door, swollen with moisture, finally gave way, and we stepped inside. Our flashlights pierced the darkness and both of us froze on the threshold. This room, it was nearly intact, a time capsule of something truly sinister. It was large, maybe 30 feet square, with a high ceiling crisscrossed by wooden support beams. To our left was a small raised platform stage, like a makeshift performance area. Facing it were rows of metal chairs bolted to the floor. There were about a dozen arranged in 3 neat rows. Many had leather restraint straps hanging from the armrests or loops on the legs. Above the stage, a sturdy crossbeam spanned the ceiling. From it dangled several ropes and thin chains, some ending in leather cuffs, others in tarnished metal hooks. The ropes swayed gently in the draft from the open door. Against one wall stood a steel cabinet, its doors ajar. Inside, hanging in a tidy line, were wooden marionette control bars, each with a tangle of strings attached. Some of those strings trailed down to the cabinet's bottom, where a few limp puppets lay crumpled, a painted wooden arm here, a child-sized leg there, a head with glass eyes staring blankly. A shudder rippled through me. This is something else," I whispered. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Mark stepped cautiously toward the stage. On it sat an old phonograph turntable, the kind with a horn speaker, though the horn had toppled over and lay in pieces. An old vinyl record was still on the platter. Faded text on its label read, "Playful Polly Poker." Mark's light caught a handwritten poster on the wall behind the stage. "Obedience Therapy Sessions, by order of Dr. R. Halsey." I felt like I was going to be sick. We had found evidence of whatever awful obedience therapy had occurred here. This was the Marionette Room. Near my feet, a clipboard lay face down. I picked it up. The paper on it was yellowed and blank with age, but beneath it on the floor, I noticed a leather-bound journal wedged under the leg of a chair. My fingers were cold as I picked it up and flipped it open to a random page. The spidery handwriting inside was still legible. The master's strings took hold. Subject 95 did not survive the session. The master was displeased. I must find more. My heart pounded harder with each word. The master, what was that? I thumbed to another page. Always more trials, it said at the bottom. The rest was smeared. Jonah. Mark's voice was a thin whisper. I glanced up and saw him standing at the open cabinet, staring at something in his hands. He turned to me and held it out. It was a marionette, nearly intact. A puppet fashioned to look like a young woman in a simple cotton dress. Its painted face had a vacant smile. But what made my blood run cold was the name scrawled across its wooden chest in faded ink. Marion, number 95. Marion. Patient number 95? The journal had just mentioned a subject 95. Oh, hell no, Mark breathed. They turned people into puppets? Before I could respond, a soft creak sounded from above us, like a weight shifting on wood. We both instinctively aimed our flashlights upward along the ceiling beam. There, crouched atop the beam, was a figure. My mouth went dry. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a person, perhaps some derelict who'd been hiding. But as our lights fixed on it, the thing twitched in a way that no living human would. It was spindly and pale, its limbs oddly bent. 2 pinpoints of light reflected back at us, its eyes. Mark gasped, stumbling a step back. "Who's there?" he croaked. In answer, a rasping chuckle emanated from the dark. The figure leapt down, landing on the stage with a dull thud. In the uncertain light, I saw what looked like a man, but wrong. His body jerked in little spasms, head cocked at an unnatural angle. He wore a filthy, tattered suit that hung off his skeletal frame. In one hand, he clutched a wooden marionette controller bar with strings dangling from it, and those strings snaked upward into the rafters, disappearing in shadow. The air in the room felt charged, buzzing. I realized the ropes and chains on the ceiling beam were now twitching, starting to move on their own. The chairs in front of the stage rattled against their bolts. Mark swore under his breath. He dropped the puppet in his hands, and the sound of it hitting the floor seemed to break a spell. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing my arm. We spun and bolted for the door, but with a deafening slam it swung shut in our faces before we could reach it. Mark yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door seemed to lock itself. Behind us, the phonograph suddenly came alive with a scratchy blare, the playful Polly Poker starting to play its jaunty, off-kilter tune. My mind raced in utter disbelief. The gaunt figure on the stage let out a guttural hiss. With a flick of its wrist, it raised the controller bar it held. In response, the ropes above unfurled like snakes. One of the leather straps whipped around Mark's ankle and yanked. He crashed to the floor. "Jonah!" he screamed, clawing at the smooth concrete as the unseen force dragged him backward toward the stage. I lunged and grabbed his arms, trying to pull him back. For a second, we were in a tug of war. Mark's eyes wild with terror, me straining with all my strength. Then several thinner strings, almost invisible, looped around Mark's wrists and jerked his arms upward, nearly pulling me off my feet. I lost my grip as Mark was lifted into the air by his arms, his legs kicking. A thick rope snaked around his waist next, hoisting him like a marionette. I heard a snapping sound and a sharp pain ignited in my shoulder. One of the strings had lashed around me now too, and flung me aside like a rag doll. I hit the floor hard, skidding into a row of chairs. From the ground, head ringing, I saw Mark suspended 10 feet up, struggling helplessly. The figure on the stage, Dr. Halsey's ghost, I realized, began to twitch its controller bar hand. In horrific synchrony, Mark's body jerked upright in midair, his limbs contorting against his will. A hoarse cry of pain tore from his throat. "No! Let him go!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. I was ignored. The ghost tilted its head and spoke in a revolting, multi-voiced whisper. "Dance." In that moment, Mark's dangling body convulsed as if electrified, then began to move in a grotesque parody of a waltz, feet dangling but twitching to the polka's rhythm, arms snapping out and in as if he were a puppet dancing on strings. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Fury and desperation overtook my fear. I grabbed one of the bolted chairs and, with adrenaline pumping, tore it free from the floor. I heaved it up at the ceiling, trying to sever the ropes. One rope connecting Mark's arm snapped from the impact, and he sagged on that side. Above, the ghost snarled, an awful sound like a dozen voices all snarling in unison. Suddenly, a thin wire whipped around my neck from behind and tightened. I gagged, dropping the chair with a clang. My hands flew up to my throat, trying to claw the wire away. In my peripheral vision, I saw an old marionette, one of the broken ones from the cabinet, hovering in the air beside me. Its cruciform control bar hovering above it with wires attached. And one of those wires was what was strangling me now, steered by invisible hands. Black spots danced in my vision. I stumbled, fighting for breath. Mark's gargled cries mixed with the tinny polka in a hellish cacophony. In a last act of desperation, I threw myself backward toward the doorway, dragging whatever was choking me into the light. The wire loosened slightly with my awkward motion, and I managed to get my fingers underneath it and wrench it over my head. The bar and puppet controlling it clattered to the ground behind me. Choking and coughing, I fumbled for the door handle again. Miraculously, it turned. Perhaps the ghost's concentration faltered for an instant. I yanked the door open. "Mark!" I screamed. "Come on!" Mark was still suspended near the stage, conscious but barely. Our eyes met. With what looked like a supreme act of will, he managed to reach up and grab the rope around his chest, trying to pry it off. The ghostly figure seemed momentarily distracted by me at the door, its head swiveling toward me with those pinprick eyes. It released one hand from the controller bar and pointed a bony finger at me. A dozen fine strings hissed through the air in my direction. I dove through the doorway, out of the room, just as those strings lashed the door frame behind me like a cracking whip. "Jonah!" I heard Mark scream, inhuman terror in his voice. I turned. He was still inside, struggling in midair as the ropes began to reel him back toward that cursed stage. I could see in his eyes that he knew I might have to leave him, but I couldn't. With a primal yell, I grabbed the door's edge and held it open. "Mark, fight it! Come on!" In that instant, Mark did something I will never forget. He reached up and wrapped both hands around the rope at his neck, the one supporting most of his weight, and he let himself drop a few inches, using his own body to snap the rope taut. There was a harsh twang as it gave way. Mark plummeted to the floor in a heap. The ghost let out an ear-splitting shriek. The voice of a man and a woman and a child, all layered together in fury. Mark, free of the ropes, scrambled on all fours, then sprinted toward me in a limping run. I seized his arm and yanked him through the doorway with me. We tumbled out into the basement hall as the heavy door slammed shut behind us with a deafening clang. Something smashed against the other side, the phantom trying to get out. Without a word, we bolted down the corridor, up the stairs, and through the first-floor hall, not daring to look back. Behind us, the basement door rattled violently, and we heard a muffled, rage-filled howl that spurred us faster. We burst out into the cool evening air through Building 8's entrance, both of us half sobbing, half gasping. We didn't stop running, across the weed-choked lawn all the way to the main drive. Only then did we collapse, heaving for breath. Mark was shaking uncontrollably, and I realized I was too. We're out, I panted, hardly believing it. Building 8 loomed in the dim twilight behind us, its door hanging wide open. But nothing followed. The nightmare stayed contained in that building, for now. It was nearly midnight by the time police and paramedics finished searching and questioning us. Mark was taken to the hospital for his injuries, severe rope burns, a dislocated shoulder, and shock. I, miraculously, had only bruises and shallow lacerations where the wires had constricted me. My throat was raw. We told the authorities everything, at least everything that we understood of it. I led them back to the Marionette Room in the basement. They found the bizarre stage, the ropes, the chairs, the puppets, all of it. But of course, no sign of any person, The old phonograph sat quietly, the record needle still in its center groove. The investigators were baffled by the chain wrapped on the inside of the door, as if someone had locked it from within. We had no explanation for that either. In the end, with no logical culprit to pursue, the official report labelled the incident a freak accident. Some mix of unstable structure, perhaps a gas leak-induced hallucination on our part, and a physical struggle to escape the building. I overheard one officer murmur words like mass hysteria and toxic fumes. They neatly wrote off Mark's and my account of what we saw as trauma-induced imaginings. But I know what we lived through. Building 8's demolition was halted indefinitely. The authorities quietly sealed up that basement room and, I suspect, removed the more disturbing contents for analysis. Perhaps they didn't want any more attention on the horrifying therapy that had taken place there decades ago. Mark recovered physically, but he refused to ever set foot back at Willard. He quit the project and moved away, needing distance from this nightmare. He won't even talk to me about it. Whenever I've tried, he just goes pale and changes the subject. I can't blame him. As for me, I wish I could bounce back and laugh it off as a ghost story, but I can't. I left contracting for a while. I find myself endlessly revisiting that night in my memories, questioning how much of it could have been real. Yet I have the scars. Faint ligature marks still circle my left wrist like a permanent bracelet, and there's a thin line on my neck that no amount of ointment will erase. I have to warn others. If you ever find yourself at the ruins of Willard Asylum, stay out of Building 8. Whatever Dr. Halsey conjured or became in that Marionette Room, it's still there, lingering in the darkness. I'm terrified it might one day find a way to leave. Even now, weeks later, I can't sleep with the lights off. I keep dreaming of that tug on my wrist, that feeling of being pulled by unseen strings. Sometimes I wake with my wrists red and sore as if bound in my sleep. And 2 nights ago, my wife found me standing in the dark with my arms raised above my head, my hands contorted as if grasping an unseen controller bar. I don't know what frightens me more, that I might be losing my mind, or that the master of the Marionette Room is still out there, tugging at my strings, waiting to reel me back in. If this story chilled you, share it with someone who thinks old buildings are just brick and wood, because some are built to hold more than memories. What happened in that basement wasn't therapy, it was rehearsal. And I think the show is about to start again. Obedience was just the first act. The performance never ended.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.